As with the Exodus story, archaeology has uncovered a dramatic discrepancy between the Bible and the situation within Canaan at the suggested date of the conquest, between 1230 and 1220 BCE.
There is a discrepancy between thus saith the Bible and thus saith the archaeological evidence. And we're talking about in reference to Canaan, which was supposedly conquered by the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. And so the Bible, it describes Canaan, what happened in Canaan, the setting of Canaan, in one way, but archaeology, it tells a completely different story. And so to find out what story it tells, we have to continue reading in the book, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman, and see if we can get some understanding.
Although we know that a group named Israel was already present somewhere in Canaan by 1207 BCE, the evidence on the general political and military landscape of Canaan suggests that a lightning invasion by this group would have been impractical and unlikely in the extreme.
The lightning invasion the authors are referring to is the story of the Israelites taking over Canaan after the Exodus and after wandering in the wilderness. And so they're saying that the evidence points to an invasion by this group as being impractical and highly unlikely.
There is abundant evidence from Egyptian texts of the Late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1150 BCE, on affairs in Canaan, in the form of diplomatic letters, lists of conquered cities, scenes of sieges engraved on the walls of temples in Egypt, annals of Egyptian kings, literary works, and hymns.
The Late Bronze Age is a period where scholars are saying that the Exodus would have happened if it happened at all. And so there's an abundance of evidence in various forms regarding the activity that was taking place during that time and in the place of Canaan, which was renamed Israel, and this is the place or the promised land for the Israelites.
Perhaps the most detailed source of information on Canaan in this period is provided by the Tel el-Amarna letters. These texts represent part of the diplomatic and military correspondence of the powerful pharaohs Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt in the 14th century BCE. The almost 400 Amarna tablets, now scattered in museums around the world, include letters sent to Egypt by rulers of powerful states, such as the Hittites of Anatolia and the rulers of Babylonia. But most were sent from rulers of city-states in Canaan, who were vassals of Egypt.
These rulers sending the Amarna letters, they were vassals to Egypt, meaning they were like puppets. And so basically, Egypt had control over that area through the use of these rulers.
The senders included the rulers of Canaanite cities that would later become famous in the Bible, such as Jerusalem, Shechem, Megiddo, Hazar, and Lachish. Most important, the Amarna letters reveal that Canaan was an Egyptian province, closely controlled by Egyptian administration.
Egypt was in control of the Promised Land during this time. And here's what they had going on.
The provincial capital was located in Gaza, but Egyptian garrisons were stationed at key sites throughout the country, like Beth Shean, south of the Sea of Galilee, and at the port of Jaffa, today part of the city of Tel Aviv.
A garrison is a military post with troops. And so Egypt, they had a garrison in key areas of Canaan during that time the Israelites were supposed to come through and take over the Promised Land. And so understand that this period in the Late Bronze Age is when Egypt was at the peak of its power.
In the Bible, no Egyptians are reported outside the borders of Egypt, and none are mentioned in any of the battles within Canaan.
But somehow the biblical writers, they didn't mention anything about Egypt controlling this area and having troops in the land. And why is that? Because we have to remember that this narrative is written many centuries after the events that they're describing, right? And so they most likely didn't know that the Egyptians were in the land at that time, right? And it probably didn't have any much relevance at all because they're making up most of these stories anyway.
Yet contemporary texts and archaeological finds indicate that they managed and carefully watched over the affairs of the country.
That's what the evidence outside the Bible shows, that Egypt was all in the business of what was happening in the Promised Land at that time.
The princes of the Canaanite cities, described in the book of Joshua as powerful enemies, were, in actuality, pathetically weak.
Joshua chapter 17, verse 18, it describes the Canaanites as having iron chariots, right, and being strong, right? But these authors are saying in actuality that they were weak. And in actuality, what that means is in real life, right, as opposed to something that's just purely imaginary. And so according to these authors, what was imaginary was the biblical description of the Canaanites being powerful, right? But in actuality, or in real life, or in reality, they were pathetically weak.
Excavations have shown that the cities of Canaan in this period were not regular cities of the kind we know in later history. They were mainly administrative strongholds for the elite, housing the king, his family, and his small entourage of bureaucrats, with the peasants living scattered throughout the surrounding countryside in small villages. The typical city had only a palace, a temple compound, and a few other public edifices, probably residences for high officials, inns, and other administrative buildings. But there were no city walls.
If there was no city walls, then there was nothing for the Israelites to knock down.
The formidable Canaanite cities described in the conquest narrative were not protected by fortifications. The reason apparently was that with Egypt firmly in charge of security for the entire province, there was no need of massive defensive walls.
The strong Egyptians were in there to protect. So they're saying that there was no need to have fortifications or walls to protect the cities.
There was also an economic reason for the lack of fortifications at most Canaanite cities. With the imposition of heavy tribute to be paid to the pharaoh by the princes of Canaan, local petty rulers may not have had the means or the authority to engage in monumental public works. In fact, late Bronze Age Canaan was a mere shadow of the prosperous society that it had been several centuries before in the Middle Bronze Age. Many cities were abandoned and others shrank in size, and the total settled population could not have greatly exceeded 100,000. One demonstration of the small scale of this society is the request in one of the Amarna letters sent by the king of Jerusalem to the pharaoh that he supply 50 men to protect the land.
We talked about this in part 6, where only 50 troops were needed to get all these people in Canaan under control if they got out of hand.
The minuscule scale of the forces of the period is confirmed by another letter, sent by the king of Megiddo, who asked the pharaoh to send 100 soldiers to guard the city from an attack by his aggressive neighbor, the king of Shechem.
Megiddo and Shechem, these are both cities in the land of Canaan. And so the king of Megiddo, he sent letters to Pharaoh asking for protection against this other aggressive Canaanite neighbor in Shechem.
The Amarna letters describe the situation during the 14th century BCE, 100 or so years before the supposed date of the Israelite conquest. We have no such detailed source of information about affairs in Canaan during the 13th century BCE. Yet Pharaoh Ramesses II, who ruled during most of the 13th century, was not likely to have slackened his military oversight of Canaan. He was a strong king, possibly the strongest of all pharaohs, who was deeply interested in foreign affairs. Other indications, both literary and archaeological, seem to show that in the 13th century BCE, the grip of Egypt on Canaan was stronger than ever.
That bear hug on Canaan was super strong at this time. And we have to remember that this is taking place during the time that the conquest in Canaan is supposed to have taken place if it were to actually been a historical event.
At times of reported unrest, the Egyptian army would cross the Sinai Desert along the Mediterranean coast and march against rebel cities or troublesome people.
With only 50 Egyptian troops required to make all folks go inside their house if they were out there acting a fool.
As mentioned, the military route in northern Sinai was protected by a series of forts and supplied with freshwater sources. After crossing the desert, the Egyptian army could easily rout any rebel forces and impose its will on the local population. Archaeology has uncovered dramatic evidence of the extent of Egyptian presence in Canaan itself. An Egyptian stronghold was excavated at the site of Bethshem to the south of the Sea of Galilee in the 1920s. Its various structures and courtyards contain statues and inscribed hieroglyphic monuments from the days of the pharaoh Seti I, 1294 to 1279 BCE, Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, and Ramesses III, 1184 to 1153 BCE. The ancient Canaanite city of Megiddo disclosed evidence for strong Egyptian influence as late as the days of Ramesses VI, who ruled toward the end of the 12th century BCE. This was long after the supposed conquest of Canaan by the Israelites.
The Egyptians still had a strong influence on Canaan, even after the period where the Israelites were supposed to have already conquered Canaan and been in the land, right? But the Bible doesn't mention anything about this, and neither does the Egyptian records. And I wonder why that is.
It is highly unlikely that the Egyptian garrisons throughout the country would have remained on the sidelines as a group of refugees from Egypt wreaked havoc throughout the province of Canaan. And it is inconceivable that the destruction of so many loyal vassal cities by the invaders would have left absolutely no trace in the extensive records of the Egyptian empire. The only independent mention of the name Israel in this period, the Victory Seal of Merneptah, announces only that this otherwise obscure people living in Canaan had suffered a crushing defeat.
The Merneptah still mentions Israel as a people living in Canaan. Where? In Canaan, right? And it's talking about them being defeated, not doing any of the defeating.
Something clearly doesn't add up when the biblical account, the archaeological evidence, and the Egyptian records are placed side by side.
Let's be clear. Something doesn't add up to the reasoning person, because to a person who's strictly a believer, everything already adds up perfectly fine to them, right? All they have to do is just open up the Bible, read what it says, and case closed. Voila, it's all over with, right? None of the other evidence that says otherwise is of any use to them. But to the reasoning person, right, things don't add up, because the Bible, it makes claims that the actual evidence doesn't support, right? And it says something completely different. And so this complicates the situation for many people, and it creates a world of confusion, and to the point where many people, they just don't know what to believe, right? And this is understandable to a degree. And this is why you have to make proper use of the power of reason, which is there to guide you to get on that ladder and go rung by rung out of the pit, and to get into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense, right? And so this is the end of part 8 commentary on the book here, The Bible Unearthed by Dr. Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Neil Asher Silberman. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.